Welcome to The Voices of War, a podcast with a simple vision to bring to life the true costs of war through the voices of those who've lived it. I'm Maz, and I speak to soldiers, academics, refugees, peacemakers, and anyone else who's been touched by war in the hope of demystifying and, most importantly, de-glorifying it. If you like what you hear, please consider showing your support by reviewing the show wherever you get your pods. You can also support us on our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy this episode. My guest today is Dr. Peter Warren Singer, who is a strategist at New America, a professor of practice at Arizona State University, and founder and managing partner at Useful Fiction. A New York Times bestselling author, Peter has been described in the Wall Street Journal as the premier futurist in the national security environment, has been named by the Smithsonian as one of the US 100 leading innovators, by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense issues, has been added by Foreign Policy to their top 100 global thinkers list, and has been made an official mad scientist for the US Army Training and Doctrine Command. No author, living or dead, has more books on a professional US military reading lists. His nonfiction books include Corporate Warriors, The Rise of the Privatized Military Industry, Children at War, Wired for War, The Robotics Revolution and Conflict in the 21st Century, Cybersecurity and Cyber War, What Everyone Needs to Know, and most recently, Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media, which explores how this relatively new technology has changed war and politics. He's also the co-author of a new type of novel, using the format of a technothriller to communicate nonfiction research. Ghost Fleet, a novel of the next World War, was both a top summer read and led to briefings everywhere from the White House to the Pentagon. His latest is Burn-In, a novel of the Real Robotic Revolution. It has been described by the creator of Lost and Watchmen as a visionary new form of storytelling, a rollercoaster ride of science fiction blended with science fact, and by the head of US Army Cyber Command as I loved Burn-In so much that I've already read it twice. Peter joins me today to discuss the impact of technology and social media in the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. And given his background, I don't think I could have found a better guest to explore this fascinating subject. Peter, thank you very much for joining me on the Voices of War.
Oh, thank you very much in turn for having me.
Now, Peter, you've written on so many different topics, whether it be private militaries, child soldiers, technology in war, role of social media, as well as imagining future wars. You know, the Wall Street Journal calls you a futurist. New America calls you a strategist. You're also a professor and a consultant. That's a lot of hats you wear. But how do you describe what you do?
That's a great question. And my poor children, when people ask them what does their dad do, they have to give a long answer as well. Essentially, I described it. I wear two hats. I've got my nonprofit analysis hat, where I do research and consulting on public policy issues, particularly related to technology and security. And I have two homes for that, New America, which is a nonprofit think tank based in Washington, D.C. And then I also teach classes at Arizona State University, online classes in cybersecurity. And then have my other hat, which is the for-profit hat, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And have written books and then founded a business called Useful Fiction that works with organizations to help them tell their story better. And primarily it's been organizations in the policy field. So we've worked with the US, Canadian, British, as well as Australian military, essentially helping them to transform white papers, strategy papers, basically the kind of things that people don't like to read. How can we turn them into narratives that both explain the content, but people are also more likely to engage with?
And I think that's your and your book, Like War, which has been an international bestseller, is I guess one of those where you've brought some really deep and interesting research into a narrative form that people can really connect to, and it's very personalized because we all live on social media nowadays. But maybe before we delve into the kind of Ukraine crisis, what does Like War mean, the title itself, and why is that title so timely and important?
So if you think of the idea of cyber war, which we've all grown, a bit comfortable with talking about over the last decade plus, it's the idea of hacking networks. But cyber war has an evil twin, so to speak, and we call that like war. And it's the idea of not hacking the network, but hacking the people on social networks by driving ideas viral through their likes, their shares, but also, of course, sometimes lies. And we see this play out in episodes that range from the rise of ISIS to the rise of Donald Trump to it can have positive effects. We think of all sorts of activist movements. It's used in marketing. It's used by celebrities. And so myself and a young researcher named Emerson Brooking, we started on that project, gosh, I want to say like 2013 period. And essentially, we started out trying to understand how social media was being used in war zones. And if you go back in time, back then, social media was thought of as either something that didn't matter much. It was light, it was airy, it was jokes. Or if it mattered, it was only for the good. Democratizing, as the New York Times described it, or you think about the Arab Spring. And we instead, we're like, well, but how's it being used in war zones? And so we started out looking at that, and then we very quickly realized that something bigger was going on. So, it wasn't just being used by groups in war. It was affecting everything from terrorism, if you think about the rise of ISIS, but it was reaching out beyond the war zone. So, ISIS was using it to recruit people to come to Syria and Iraq, but it was also using it to inspire acts of terrorism everywhere from Paris to Texas. It had an overlap with other bad things like crime. We saw drug cartels using it. We saw street gangs using it. But then we also saw an overlap with politics. So if you were looking at Russian information warfare targeting, we looked at how it was targeting Ukrainian soldiers in 2014, but they were also targeting Ukrainian politics. They were targeting elections, Hungary, Poland, Brexit in the UK, of course, the US 2016 election. But then when you looked at the tactics of it, you also saw this overlap where, ISIS members were copycatting what Taylor Swift was doing. Or in turn, you had, the biggest online celebrity, Donald Trump, become a politician. But then we had the overlap with the Russian information warfare stuff to aid and abet him. So, basically pull back on all of this. Essentially, you had the rise of this concept called like war. And the big takeaway lesson was, it wasn't just shaping what was happening online. It was shaping the real world. It was shaping how people not just thought and what they believed, but their actions, whether they joined a protest, whether they joined an extremist group, how they voted, to what they thought was the science and the reality of everything from climate change to a global pandemic. And of course, we've seen that play out in the Ukraine conflict. All the lessons, all the research that, we surfaced for like war, it was taken to extremes, put on almost steroids in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and a particular thing that stands out for me personally is because you zoom out, but both in your book and your research and writing, you zoom out at the macro level, because as an individual, it's very often we're in our little information bubble, and we convince ourselves that because the information finds us, we don't even need to find it. It pings in my pocket. It's very easy to get lost in your own rabbit hole and not see the bigger picture. And I think naming it like war really gives a poignant title to what is actually happening, because most people, I still think, our awareness is getting better, but most people don't really think of it in such a way. I'm merely checking Facebook. I'm merely seeing what my friends are up to. But then there's all these other things that you are being exposed to. How do you think this psychology is playing out? And perhaps, after this question, we'll focus on Ukraine. But how do you think the psychology is really playing out on the human individual against this monstrous machine that is, in this case, social media?
That's such a great question. And there's a number of elements to bring into it. One is, too many people believe that what they see online, they're the one that purely determines it, when in reality, of course, social media it's a conflict space. It's also a communication space. It's also a commerce space. It's a marketplace. It's owned and operated by private companies that, of course, are for profit. And so it is designed to maximize your engagement, maximize your time on platform, as well as steer you to products that people have essentially sort of paid for, whether it in advertising or the like. And so, if you are on, whether it's Facebook, you dated yourself by referencing Facebook, and now everybody's going to think you're an old fuddy-duddy.
It's true.
Like Facebook,
TikTok, sorry.
That's just what our grandparents are on. Again, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, whatever it is, you have algorithms that shape what you see, recommend what you see, push up on the side, give you greater options. And of course, it's there to, as if, serve you. Oh, you might be interested in X, but it's about maximizing that engagement. And then you have the other cross with it, which is the role of others in your network. And that's that aspect of psychology as well, where it's both about maximizing engagement, but also it's people who think like you, people that you think are right because they think like me. You trust them. And then in turn, when you share it out, you're giving that stamp of trust on it for others to engage with. And so that leads to, one of the lessons of this project is to understand that you are simultaneously a target and a consumer and a combatant. So whether it's Taylor Swift, who, I jokingly think of her as the Marie von Clausewitz of social media strategy. And she literally, like Marie von Clausewitz, she wrote a strategy essay as a young teen about how her understanding of social media and how she was going to use it to achieve her goals. Just like Marie edited all of Carl von Clausewitz's, turgid prose and turned it into On War. But the point is, whether it's a celebrity like Taylor Swift to a Donald Trump to Russian information warrior or Chinese information warrior or a politician in Melbourne or a marketing company in Sydney, whatever it is, they identify you, not just you as an individual, but the category that you're within.
The profile, your profile. Yeah,
exactly. Figure out ways to reach you. In turn, you are a consumer. You take that information in, you decide whether to click on it or not. They tried to get it to you, but you decide whether to read it or not. But then there's that combatant side, which is the real goal is to get you not only to consume it, but for you to share it out, to take that point of view, to take that side, whether it's the side of that political party, the side of that nation in a conflict, the side of that brand, and then you to put your stamp on it and carry it forward to your network so it goes even more viral. One of the other psychology things that's really interesting is that when we looked at examples of things that went viral, whether it was awful things that went viral, ISIS propaganda, or good things that went viral, think of Ice Bucket Challenge. They all had these elements that consistently tried to tap into that psychology side to get you to join in. It was provocative. I don't mean like it, revealed skin, but rather it provoked a certain kind of emotion, happiness, anger. Another element of it is it consistently they create a sense of community. It's not just you, it's you joining a group, and we're part of a team, we're part of a squad, we're part of a cause. It tries to enlist you in that, and then you begin to identify with it. And then those who don't agree with you, they're the other side. And again, that's whether we're talking about good things or bad things, they all kind of follow the same pattern. I'll just end here by saying the challenge of this for democracies, for kids that are just doing research for their school report, to members of the military, is we're constantly bombarded with this. Most of us are on these networks, but we're actually not trained. We're not given, what we would think of as almost like digital literacy skills. So I know a lot of members of your audience are on the military side. So think about how you receive training in cybersecurity, awareness. Don't click that link. Have good passwords. And yet you're targeted by everything from Russian or Chinese information warfare, not to click the link, but to take that point of view, to marketing, to if you're in the U.S. military, we've been hit by some major issues regarding anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theory, and the like. And yet most don't get training in how do I handle the information warfare side of things? And I think that's a major gap in whether you're thinking about professional military education or you're thinking about, again, you're a kid who's just doing school research. You got to get that kind of training so that you don't go on YouTube and suddenly your school report is, describing how aliens built the pyramids.
That's such a wonderful summary of what is a huge problem. And social science gives us the tools. I mean, we know what type of biases we have and how programmable we are. We like to delude ourselves with this idea that we're autonomous, free-thinking beings, which we know fully well once we start looking at the research that we're absolutely not. We are all susceptible to our own biases, our confirmation bias, our in-group think, and of course, social media just has taken this to scale. And the other point I want to pick up on is that really speaks to me. Oh, sorry, you want to jump in? Yeah, please jump in.
I want to jump on that because you raised really good points. So there's one is that we're all shaped by that, and yet it's everybody thinks it's someone else, right? So we think we're the exception. We're the exception to the rule. And having that kind of self-awareness is really, really challenging. And again, it kind of, it's part of, being trained up in. And then look, I'm not claiming to be perfect at it either. I'm like on social media, I'm like the doctor, who, is telling people not to smoke. And then I'm like, you might catch me out, puffing on a cigarette. Even I fall into this, but there's another part of it. And it brings in the work that we've been doing on Useful Fiction, which is, when we're not just on the consumer, but when we're communicating outwards, when whether we're writing a memorandum or a PowerPoint or a speech or a white paper, we know that humans are not persuaded purely by fact, purely by a series of bullet points. And yet, how do we consistently communicate? We keep on doing it the same old way. And so that's what we've been trying to bring in with the useful fiction approach is, don't replace the white paper. I mean, you still need it. You still need the memorandum, but let's bring in also the oldest communication technology of all, which is story. Because the human brain is more reactive to story because, evolution, we've literally been using it since we were gathered around a fire in a cave. PowerPoint, it's 31 years old. So, of course, it's not going to be the best way to connect. And so it's that part that you bring in those the psychology of how we consume, the psychology of how we communicate. We want to think that pure logic, pure facts, just I marshal the right set of bullet points and that'll win the day. But that's not how it persuades us, and that's not how we need to persuade others.
Yeah, absolutely. And the power of story in its persuasiveness is unchallenged, unrivaled. And of course, this is why we see things like conspiracy theories take hold because, disparate facts are weaved into some grand narrative, some grand story of a puppet master that's, pulling the strings. And of course, because it invokes emotions, people respond to it, which is
the power of conspiracy. Yes, I was going to say the power of conspiracy theory is, every good narrative, whether it's, we're telling a true story, we're building up a fictional story. Narrative is not just scenario, it's character. And the power of conspiracy theory is the character is always the target audience. You're the hero of the story who figured out the truth that this group out there was trying to trick us all with, and you realize it, and you're the hero who is now telling others the truth. And that's why conspiracy theory is a really, really powerful communication approach, because it turns whoever it is, they always believe they're the hero of the story. Even, you know, the person who's standing on the soapbox screaming craziness, or they're doing it on Twitter, they believe they're the hero, because it's conspiracy theory creates, it adds in that element of character.
That is, yeah, absolutely. That speaks so much to me, given what we've gone through with the pandemic. I mean, it's just, and I even have people in my close circles who've gone down that rabbit hole and have become, as you said, their own heroes. You know, they're standing up to the mass narrative, the mass media narrative, those who are trying to deceive us, for their own nefarious motivations. And this brings me to the second point I want to make, which is that one of the things that social media has done is taken us from active, and this is what you're talking about, from kind of passive recipients of information into active, heroes, warriors. We can have our voice heard, in fact, seen through our videos that we might post and so on. And maybe this is a good way to pivot to Ukraine right now, because I think that's something that we're really seeing, is that, traditionally civilians in war have been passive, voiceless victims who, we see snapshots on CNN or BBC or newspapers of, lines of refugees fleeing. And I was one of those. I was in one of those kind of images myself, fleeing from Bosnia, Sarajevo. I was a passive, victim or survivor. But now that's very different. We're now seeing those same refugees, those same people who are, living in cellars, hiding in from the invasion, who are beaming out videos and images to the world. What are your thoughts on this? Because I've read your Politico article. I'll put a link to it in the notes. You really capture this, well, arguably rather new phenomenon that we're seeing of how social media has been weaponized. Maybe get some thoughts on that.
It's such a powerful shift in communication technology that then shifts the way that we see, and then in quotation marks, experience the conflict. And I say in quotation marks because it's, it's like this, you're there, but you're really not there. And let's be very, very clear about that. And of course, you've got this personal connection. And what I'm getting at is that there's a shift in the who, there's a shift in the when, there's a shift in the where. So the shift in the who, you used to rely on the media to be the one that determined what was the news out of all the events going on in the world. The media, which is literally the term for the middle. It's the profession in the middle that would select which of the news to cover, and then in turn, how to cover it, what narrative to put on top of it, what explanation, etc. And then it would send it out through a set number of channels, and the channel might be the radio station, the channel might be the newspaper, that and so instead now anyone potentially is part of the media, whether it is the Ukrainian civilian who pops something on TikTok as they huddle in the subway from bombing, or as they dance around a destroyed BMP laughing about it. The media can be a leader. One of the most powerful things Zelensky has done is, he's YouTubing himself as he's walking down the street or meeting with soldiers. The media can also be the inadvertent. It can be the Russian soldier who unintentionally puts information out there And in turn, we can all consume it, see it, digest it. That's a shift in the who. You have a shift in the when. It's all in potentially real time. So it's not waiting hours, days, months. Go back in history and think about, how long people used to have to wait for information flow to circulate around the world. It can be shared instantaneously, and that gives a rapid speed to it, right? And then you've got the final part of it, which is the where. It's the information can be collected anywhere, anywhere that there's a smartphone, anywhere that there is a traffic cam, anywhere that there is, Eastern Europe well. So, a lot of the really cool and striking imagery of Russian military buildup before the conflict was actually from dashboard cams in the cars, which people had there to document wrecks, not to document Russian military buildup. But the point is, it can be gathered anywhere. Oh, by the way, it can also be gathered by civilian satellites, et cetera. But in turn, it can be consumed anywhere. You can consume, and then you can analyze that information and share it out, whether you're sitting in your office or you're sitting on the subway. You can mine that information and go share it out with your friends, or you can document, hold it, I've just found evidence of this Russian military movement over here, and share it out with the world. It's incredibly powerful. Now, let's be very, very clear. In no way, shape, or form am I saying, conventional warfare is ended, or, the physical fight doesn't matter. No, absolutely not. It's just the information space is now wrapped up within the physical battlefield, and of course the geopolitical battlefield as well. And I think Ukraine is just a powerful example of that, where on the information side, we've seen the Ukrainian government narrative serve to help keep its soldiers and civilians in the fight, as opposed to the Russian goal of, causing a very rapid collapse. You've seen this sort of unifying effect. You've seen this, we can win. You've seen stories of heroicism, of martyrs, et cetera, take off, mocking the Russian soldiers, et cetera. But that part of keeping them in the fight, it's equally been important that its effect on the narrative outside. So part of the taking off of the Ukrainian message in our information ecosystem, whether it's in Australia or the US, is that it's what's led to the delivery of thousands of anti-tank and anti-air rockets. That is partly how the Ukrainians have been able to cause such pain on the Russian invaders. It's also led to the massive financial and economic sanctions, not just from governments and unexpected governments. I mean, and Switzerland is joining in the sanctions.
And Sweden is giving you arms.
You've lost the information war, right? But again, that part matters because, of course, it's not just the physical toll on the battle that hopefully alters Putin's calculations. As much as I would like, I don't know if he's going to be persuaded all that much by Russian soldier losses, but the effect on his economy, the effect on what that means for Russian politics of these massive sanctions, et cetera, which is driven by that information warfare side, that again circles back to, affecting the flow and hopefully the end of the overall war itself.
Yeah, and there's a clear asymmetry in the Ukraine use of information and the power that it's garnering through it, and of course the global reach. It's almost they've really opened all the taps, to communicate to the rest of the world. Whereas Russia has done completely the opposite. It's completely turned the taps off. It's closed off its internal information domain, and it's controlling, or trying to control the narrative so tightly that it makes it really an asymmetric war. On this, how important do you think is the justice or the justness of the Ukrainian struggle, how important is it in the victory of this information war that we're seeing from the Ukrainian side?
I think it's very important, but it's not the only causal factor. So, let's pull back and I think what's been so striking to people is not just as you laid out the Ukrainian message, the Ukrainian side has won out in the information war, but who it's done it against, right? The supposed Russian masters at it. And I think there's a couple of elements at play. One is the Ukrainians have actually been the ones who've been masterful this time around. And part of that is that they and the wider world has been studying, has been watching, has been learning. So, I described it as, if you compare to what Russia was able to do in Ukraine in 2014 or US election in 2016, it was effectively pushing against an open door. Same thing throughout most of the Trump administration. And a lot of what it was able to get away with wasn't possible as people learned their tricks, their tactics, their, let's be more formal, their TTPs.
Yeah.
The battle space also changed in terms of the platform companies themselves, altered what was allowed. So, back in 2016, during the US election, for example, there were more than 60,000 Russian bot accounts that shaped narratives. There was more than 3,000 known Russian sock puppet accounts. So bot algorithm driving overall trends, sock puppet, a real person but behind a fake account. A lot of that low-hanging fruit that the Facebooks and the Twitters were allowing in 2016, they're no longer allowing now. A little bit too late, but at least they caught up. So the Ukrainians, it's been essentially, as we were talking about earlier, the space had changed and they brought in all sorts of best practices. And they were aided by this wider network of governments from the US, NATO, to online networks of activists and security analysts. So that was one key. Basically, US, Ukraine, Australia, sort of all these forces learning lessons and doing it better. The second problem is a disconnect between Russia's kind of operational needs and Putin's political needs. So his information warfare side, he had to push the narrative, both targeting Ukraine, but also the West, but also his own audience of, I'm not invading, I'm responding to an emergency. And secondly, fait accompli. It's just all done. Ukraine, you've collapsed. To West, why would you even think about putting in harsh sanctions? Ukraine's already collapsed. To his own people, this is not a war. It's over. It's easy. It's a special operation. And the problem is he needed that for political reasons, but it didn't match the reality of, essentially, obviously it was an invasion, but also there was no quick collapse. And so you had that kind of disconnect. And then the third is what you brought up, which is the justness of the cause. Obviously, that's powerful. That's important, not just to us morally and politically, but obviously the narrative side, the David versus Goliath. Who are you going to choose? You're going to choose David. I think there's also something else going on in terms of I don't have the analytics side to support it. It's just kind of a gut feel, but there's been so much bad going on. There's been so much, whether it's pandemic, extremism, division, and a lot of those issues. It's been sometimes it's been hard to figure out how to handle it, or it's been kind of gray. Whereas it is just It's so clear there. And I think we were all kind of waiting
we needed an enemy. We needed a new enemy to feel good about being good.
I think that feeds into it. But again, let's do a counterfactual. Let's imagine, Ukraine's invaded. Its cause is, it's being beaten up on by a bigger neighbor. But let's imagine a world where Ukraine doesn't handle the information operation as effectively. The Russian invasion forces are not documented weeks beforehand. Zelensky doesn't communicate effectively. He acts like Putin. Zelensky, let's imagine Zelensky only gives briefings from a palace at the end of a long table, or even worse, he acts like the leadership did in Afghanistan. Zelensky gets on a plane and leaves Ukraine with a briefcase full of cash. Imagine a world where that happens. Imagine there's not the kind of global movement to pressure corporations. Are you really going to stay in Russia and do business? Imagine if that doesn't happen. Even if the Ukrainian cause is, as you know, they're the victim in the story. I don't think you have the same kind of outcomes, and I think that counterfactual illustrates, the importance of the information side of the fight. Doesn't mean it's determinative, but I think it really does show the value of it.
And it's also democratizing war in many ways, right? Because we, as active consumers of social media information, we're telegraphing or signaling, our support and asking our governments to do more. And I have no doubt that that's played a role in Germany. Why Germany dropped its Ostpolitik, and all of a sudden, Nord Stream 2 has been turned off, and Germany's arming with F-35s, or Switzerland, or Sweden, that's been neutral for 200 years, is now giving weapons. I have no doubt that is partially because of the power of social media and the narrative that constituents in these various countries have embraced and have stood up and have, I guess, through their voice or through the sheer mass and the scale that it's gone to. We're seeing even the US, right? Even many Republicans who were largely pro, Russia, have now sided with Ukrainians. I think even Trump has now, talked of Zelensky as a hero, which is, that's really following your constituents, right? That's pivoting to where the momentum is going, right?
You could get whiplash by just how rapidly we've seen both, historic policy changes by nations, but also quite hypocritical shifts by politicians. And you hit it exactly right in terms of historic shifts in European politics, and motivated both by the threat of Russia, but also by populations that were once divided on key questions now coming together and saying, no, we're not, this policy we support. You think of even, Germany, the example I like to use is that, there was we ought to aid Ukraine. And the first thing that the government did was offer 500 helmets. And its own populace was like, no, that's no. So the government's like, well, we're finally gonna aid, and then
we're doing our part.
And within 24 hours, it had shifted to, we're actually gonna also give rockets. So you've got that, but then you also noted that just the incredible, and I'm just going to show my own politics, the incredible, fascinating, and disgusting shifts by certain politicians. You've got, Trump, who is on record. It's not me making it up. It's his own quotes describing Putin as a, quote, genius, Putin as, quote, savvy. Related to Zelensky, he literally shook down Zelensky he said, basically held off giving military aid. Why don't you, I believe the quote was, why don't you do us a favor? This is the infamous phone call where it was, we're going to hold off do us a favor and find dirt on my political rival, Joe Biden, and only then will you get your military aid. And then after all that, he's suddenly out there, oh yeah, he's actually a brave guy. Or a different example would be our former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who literally screamed at a journalist 1 year ago, do you think Americans care about effing, but he used the actual word, Ukraine, to a year later saying, oh, this is why we ought to be giving more aid to Ukraine. I mean, it's craziness, but that's actually part of, something to be aware of in social media is the concept of what we call gaslighting. And gaslighting is when you basically sort of push a reality that doesn't match reality, but if you just keep doing it enough, you hope that it sticks and creates an information bubble, as you noted earlier, around your target audience, that they believe it. And so even if you're on record saying X, if you can just keep saying why, maybe people ultimately will believe, or enough people in your own information bubble will believe that you stood for Y rather than X.
Yeah, which is incredible. I mean, and again, that's part of the human psychology, right? We are so susceptible and vulnerable to it. And because there's so much information, coming at us, it's very hard to remember what somebody said a year ago. I mean, 3 days ago, let alone a year ago. And we can, and I really like the term you use bandwagoning, the bandwagoning effect that we're seeing. I wondered, do you see, and I'm conscious of our time, and I'll wrap this up soon, but while I have you, I just can't help but ask you the dangers of what we're just talking about as well. I mean, because we're seeing, as we just talked about, this kind of virality of, in this case, it's objectively the right thing to do. And of course I'm biased, but I consider Ukraine to be the victim here. And therefore what's happening in the information space is, in my view, and of course yours as well, is the right thing. And most of my audience will agree. However, and you're a futurist, in the future, we can potentially see the use of these same technologies and the same emotional triggers that they invoke in us. As we're seeing in the pandemic, for example, in some elements of the society, we could potentially see the same for other wars, that where we have information and social media being weaponized to support certain wars that may not be as just and righteous as we're seeing the resistance of the Ukrainians. How do you view that particular problem, and can we even do anything about it?
I think we've already seen it within this conflict. I mean, I've been very transparent with you that I'm trying to be analytical, but I'm a human and I live in a democracy, and I believe in Ukraine's side is right compared to the Russian invader. But even within that, we've seen examples of a good illustration would be the stories of the ghost of Kiev, the Ukrainian fighter ace who, reputedly shot down 6 Russian jets within the first hours of the war. Or the defenders of Snake Island, who, when the Russian Navy ship tells them to surrender, and they say, go fuck yourself. And then supposedly all of them are killed. And then it turns out that each of these, like so much in war and the internet, has an element of truth in it, but is maybe not 100% factual. Yeah. So Ghost of Kiev. We definitely had Russian jets shot down over Kiev. Was it actually 6? Yeah. Not clear. Was it actually all 6 shot down by a single individual? Not clear, and probably not true. Defenders of Snake Island, it turns out that they all were not martyrs, that at least some, or maybe it's still unclear, but that they may have been captured as opposed to being killed. And what was really interesting is that when you've seen these follow-ups that say, okay, but X happened, we've documented. In the comments, there's people saying, normally I would care about truth, but why don't you give this one to Ukraine? They got so much else going, and so that's something to be aware of. Another issue, of course, is to be aware of. We call it the concept of card stacking, where there's an overall war, there's all the cards, but you're seeing just a couple elements of it. They're ones that people present to you and or you're more drawn to because of they're in your network or you find those stories more powerful. So, if you just followed kind of most of our feeds, it would be only imagery of Russian tanks being blown up or Russian units being defeated. But at the same time, if you pull out a map, you'd go, well, I saw these examples of Russian losing, but hold it, they've actually seized, a lot of terrain. And so you get, two different viewpoints. And so again, that's something that's happened already within this war. And as you note, we're going to see it in any future war. Everybody's looking and learning from this. I think an interesting question to kind of end on is what are we learning? What are our militaries learning from the war in Ukraine? We're learning the importance of the information warfare side. We're learning here's how you do it, how you do it well, how you don't do it well. We're obviously learning about a lot of other technologies out there. I mean, you think about the discourse around drones, unmanned systems. I mean, it used to be, that was, either they don't matter or they're just good for counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. And obviously we're seeing them play a pretty significant role in a conventional fight. But what are other nations out there learning from it? As an example of China.
Exactly.
And I think that China is learning from this a couple of things. One, don't let the information environment stand up and be there to be utilized by your adversary. The Russians left up Ukrainian networks for two reasons. One, they thought it was to their advantage. They thought that they would be able to push out information that would rapidly collapse the Ukrainian state. Second, they logistically depended on it. They're literally using civilian cell networks and the like. I think of China looking at like a Taiwan scenario goes, we're not going to make that kind of mistake. I think the other thing that China looks at is this larger global coalition of democracies and corporations that came together to punish and sanction Russia. I think China looks at that and says, okay, what do we need to do over the next several years to keep that from ever happening to us? Both, how do we ensure that we're less dependent on these financial systems? So what they did to the ruble, they can't do to our currency. But also the flip side, how do we make sure that they're reliant and dependent on us so that all the different economies and corporations that could fairly easily walk away from business in Moscow don't walk away from business in Beijing. And I think those are the sort of questions that are going to be with us for years to come.
Absolutely. On that note, Peter, I'm conscious of our time, so I really appreciate the time you have given me, and we've gone a little bit over as well. So thank you so much. Deeply insightful, as I expected, and I hope to speak to you again in the future.
Appreciate you having me on.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Voices of War. And since you got this far, please consider showing your support by liking and reviewing the show wherever you catch your pods. Also, if you're able, please consider showing your support through our Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee page. Links to both are in the show notes. Thank you, and until next time.